Thank you everyone for coming today. I'm really excited about today's talk, which is part of our series at Annenberg called Conversations on Race. My name is Jessa Lingel. I'm an associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communication. And I'm also core faculty at Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies here at Penn. And I'm really delighted to have our guest speaker today, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. She is an assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. Dr. Taylor is a scholar of racial inequality and public policymaking and the various ways that Black communities have challenged or resisted these constraints. She writes extensively on race and politics, Black social movements and organizing, and radical activism in politics. She's the author of Race for Profit, How Banks in the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Homeownership, published in 2019 by University of North Carolina Press, which was longlisted for a National Book Award for Nonfiction and a 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer in History. Dr. Taylor's book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, won the Lannan Cultural Freedom Award for an especially notable book in 2016. She's the editor of How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, which won the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ nonfiction in 2018. She's currently working on a project tentatively titled Morning in America, or Black America's Nightmare, Reaganism, Racism, and the Long Decade of the 1980s. Her writing has also appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, The New Yorker, and Jacobin, and she's been a guest on Democracy Now!, NPR's All Things Considered, The Intercept, and NBC's Why Is This Happening with Chris Hayes. I'm really delighted that you're able to join us today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, our format is I'm just gonna have, I have some questions that Dr. Taylor and I are gonna chat about, and then we'll open it up for comments from the audience, and just really hoping to have an engaged conversation with everyone. I will say you can go ahead and use the chat to ask questions. You can also use the Q&A, and I'll try and moderate those towards the end. And I think IT will also be moderating or looking in on Q&As if you have any technical questions that need to be addressed during the talk. So before we start talking about Dr. Taylor's work, and specifically her work on how white supremacy has manifested in inequalities around homeownership and property, I thought it was particularly important to acknowledge the history of land and property here at Penn. While this talk is virtual, it's hosted by the Annenberg School for Communication, which sits on land once stewarded by the Lenape people. History, the Lenape stretch from Delaware to southeastern New York. Sovereignty over this land was never ceded, and reparations have never been made. I also want to say that while statements like this one can be important in drawing attention to enduring consequences of white settler colonialism, statements alone do not meaningfully adjudicate the long history of systemic violence and oppression against Indigenous people, and that requires not just rhetoric, but sustained activist work. So, before we get to questions about your work, I just want to check in. It's been a year of pandemic living and Zoom lectures, so how are you doing?
I'm tired.
That's fair.
No, I think that this whole endeavor has, been exhausting for some of us and catastrophic for other of us. And, I think that if anything comes out of this situation has been, well, at least, one thing has been the exposure of the kind of deep, cruel, abiding inequities of American society. And, I think that in and of itself is not a recipe for transformation, obviously. I mean, there have been any number of times in this country's history where some sort of crisis has exposed that. But I think the events of last summer, the George Floyd uprisings, were an important development. And, I hope that that kind of pressure, continues. So I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted with the school year. I'm sure most people are. But, there's a lot of work to do. So, but thank you for asking. How are you? How are you doing?
You know, I would like to share a really good thing that happened to me in the last week, which is that I got a community garden plot in my neighborhood in South
Oh,
Philly.
fantastic.
It's a community garden that has been running for 70 years. And I'm
Oh,
just like
wow.
really looking forward to meeting more of my neighbors and to gardening. I also have a 6-month-old baby, and I realized that I have effectively rented a backyard for the summer. And I'm just like really pumped. And so I'm looking forward to the semester being over so I can just garden a bunch.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's really good.
It's been energizing, and I haven't even done anything yet. It's
I
just
know. I think we
aspirational.
got a taste of what it could be like last week when it was 70 degrees for a couple of days. So yes.
Yeah, that's the day I signed up, when it was
you and everybody else.
yeah, I bet they had a lot of, if it were this weekend, they wouldn't have got so many people there. All right, so I wanted to ask, you've written 3 books, which is an incredible feat. There's definitely an arc that I see across them, but I would just love to hear you talk about the trajectory of these 3 books. Like, how did you get from one to the other?
That's a good question. They all sort of come about from very different things, although I think politically, they're sort of held together by some of the same questions about the genesis of power and the different ways and circumstances under which Black people in particular try to fight that and try to transform that into something else. So from Black Lives Matter to Black liberation really kind of, I wrote that book very quickly, even though it was a book that in some form or another I had been thinking about for a long time. And so, part of it came out of my experience organizing. I lived in Chicago for a long time. I was an organizer for years before I decided I needed to go back to school to finish my BA. And then that I wanted to go to graduate school to try to understand why Chicago was so segregated and what the history behind that was. And so I had experiences organizing around criminal justice issues, around housing, but really in the last couple of years that I was in graduate school in Chicago, most of my organizing centered around both housing issues, but also around police brutality. I think for people who were kind of working on issues of criminal justice, that we could anticipate what would eventually become Black Lives Matter. And so, I remember writing in June of 2012 that both the pace of public recognition around police brutality and a kind of a much more sharp response from the Black public to that was creating the conditions for some kind of explosion. And so I think that, by the time Mike Brown was killed, that these were questions that I had been thinking about in particular for a while. And so, I wrote that, I started to write that book in January of 2015. And it was really sort of me thinking about the kinds of questions I would expect to be confronted with if I were continuing to be organizing, but also the arguments that I would be engaged with alongside people with whom I was organizing with if I had not moved across the country to start a new job. And how we got free really came out of some of the experiences that I had when, you know, giving talks about the BLM book. And, you know, the way that there were a lot of Black women who were organizers in the kind of movement for Black lives that was different from earlier iterations of police brutality work, and not from the 60s, but you know, from the early aughts, the late 1990s, certainly the aftermath of the LA uprising. So this was a new development, and you could see people kind of searching for radical frameworks to make sense of their own politics, their own situation, but also the questions that they had that were particular to the experiences of Black women. And so that was really the context within which I decided to, you know, that I was motivated to try to capture the power of the Combahee Statement for like a new generation of activists and radicals. And then Race for Profit is, you know, is a revision of my dissertation. And so when I think, you know, I was working on that and how we get free during I had a year of leave after my third year review. And, you know, so for me, it felt like a lot of time, you know, because I was used to like doing many things at the same time, and having time off made it seem like I had an enormous amount of time. So, you know, I did a lot of new research for that book. I hadn't looked at it really for 3 years because I could not deal with that after it was such a mad, insane scramble around the dissertation. I never know how particular these experiences are. I remember I spent the first year of working on my dissertation, writing chapter 1, and then the chapter 2 was like 6 or 7 months. And then I got a postdoc, you know, which required that I be post doctorate. So then I wrote chapters 3 through 6 between May, April, and June, you know, and so I just felt trashed and like barely alive. And so I hadn't looked at it in like 3 years. And then I was, you know, excited that I was still interested, you know, in working on it. And I did a bunch of new research, and I rewrote the manuscript about 4 times. And as I was hurtling across Spain, I went to Spain to do a book tour on the BLM book for 6 weeks. And, you know, we had a 3-year-old, and I was working in the morning, working at nap time, working through the night. And it was all very exciting. And yeah, and so the book came together, and I think was certainly changed and influenced by not just my experiences writing the other 2 books, but by the politics of those books. Certainly the focus on the efforts of Black women in Race for Profit were heightened both by my move to Philadelphia and, you know, the coming into contact with, and I mean, this is the serendipity of history, is like meeting a lawyer who initiated the first class action lawsuit in response to these programs here in Philly, who was still practicing at Community Legal Services, and you know, who was very eager to meet with me, and then just had boxes of information and just important stories to tell about how it was Black women coming to his office that it's what compelled him to do this lawsuit in the first place. And I just think that the context of the movement itself, and then my particular investigation into it and writing about it, really shifted the focus for me away from a kind of muscular statist history into, some of that, which, I enjoy, but also more importantly is understanding the impacts of public policy in these programs in the lives of people they are intended for, and how those people respond to that, which I do think is a kind of underlying theme in most of the stuff that I do and I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that, so your most recent book, Race for Profit, it's, a powerful history of systemic racism and discrimination within the real estate industry and at the level of government policy and agencies. And I thought the book's central concept of predatory inclusion was super generative, not just in terms of property and housing, but more broadly as an ideological practice of systemic racism. And it made me think a little bit about Tressie McMillan Cotton's work on for-profit colleges, for example. Like, we're going to predatorily include you into this project, which is a different manifestation of this American dream. But I wanted, for folks who haven't had a chance to read the book, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the concept of predatory inclusion and why it matters for race and freedom in the US.
So for me, in the context of this book, which is really about we've all heard about the period of exclusion and redlining and the role of the federal government and really preventing Black people from becoming homeowners. And so a lot of that history ends in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And when the historiography ends in that way, it creates an impression that this was the narrative arc from slavery to freedom, right? That the passage of the Fair Housing Act represented the end of housing discrimination. And clearly that is not the case. I mean, anybody who talks about housing, the first question that you're asked is, well, why does housing discrimination continue to persist long after the passage of the Fair Housing Act? I mean, this is the last year, or 2018 was the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, to very muted public celebrations or recognition, because it is very difficult to ascertain what the impact of that act has been. And so for me, I wanted to understand what happened from this kind of organized exclusion of Black people to the banishment of housing discrimination, and what did it mean for Black people to be included in the housing market, free of formal discrimination? And so there are a few things that kind of occurred to me as I was trying to figure this out. And one is part of predatory inclusion is understanding what happens when the United States just arbitrarily declares that a racist practice is no longer legal. What happens when we go from a kind of color conscious law to a color blind law? And what was clear to me is that if there is nothing done to actually rehabilitate the damage that has been created through color conscious law, then it is impossible for these color blind laws to truly operate in a color blind way. So in housing, it means that if the federal government, aided by its private allies, are able to disinvest Black areas, meaning that capital in the form of, home improvements, of neighborhood community development, in terms of the development of local commerce, if none of that is actually developed, and that these places are merely seen as spaces to warehouse people, but to not actually accrue in, sentimental or monetary value over time, then when that is declared, when the practices that created that are no longer declared legal, you are still left with a landscape that has been pockmarked by these policies over, in this case, for the previous formally 34 years, but really the practices of real estate over the entirety of the 20th century were tied to the racial exclusion of Black people. So now those conditions of deprivation that have been created by a combination of public policy and private practice become the new information used by banks and other types of lenders to regard Black people and Black communities as risky. It becomes the kind of visual cue to treat African Americans differently as consumers. And those conditions of those communities that have been created by this racist public policy are now transformed into the conditions of risk. And what all of that means is that it creates the circumstance by which banks can charge higher fees, by which higher interest rates can be collected, by which you are treated completely differently in the marketplace because your community that has been disinvested from for decades prior is now seen as risky. And because that risk over time has become conflated with race, it means that even when Black people leave those spaces, they carry the risk with them. So Black people trying to get mortgages in other kinds of neighborhoods, or trying to get, or to simply move as renters into other neighborhoods, are regarded differently because of the way that segregation has helped to essentially suture the conditions of deprivation and dilapidation and disinvestment to Black people. And so Black people can be included into these new relationships, but almost always on predatory terms, because the harms, the disrepair that was created from racism and racist policies in the first place has never been acknowledged. The FHA, when they changed their policies in the 1960s, never acknowledged that race was a motivating factor in the creation of these policies in the first place. They continued to cling to the argument that these were financial decisions. These were economic decisions that had nothing to do with race. So in not acknowledging race as a factor, and not acknowledging the ways that these policies and the actions of the private sector created these conditions in Black communities, it means that they are never fully undone. They are never fully repaired, and they continue in the new colorblind world. They continue in the same pernicious way, and it continues to have reverberations, because when subprime lending becomes a gathering phenomenon in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, it is based on the same things, right? Like the same communities that have been disinvested historically are now termed as subprime. Those conditions become the basis upon which Black consumers are targeted and are treated differently by lenders, because it continues to go without repair. So a social scientist who's also a lawyer in Chicago, I can't remember his name, I write about briefly in the book, when the subprime lending crisis was unfolding, he mapped and I brought him to Princeton a couple of years ago, and he showed this map that overlapped with the redlining maps of the previous era of where the low-income homeownership programs that I look at in the book were located, and subprime lending, and they're all in the same areas. All of not all, but many of these areas map on top of each other. So you get new iterations, new generations of what I refer to as predatory inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I definitely appreciate in the book, it is sort of filling in a gap that I certainly had in my knowledge between the Fair Housing Act and redlining, and then subprime mortgages. And so that to me was an important contribution of that book. I wanted to switch gears a little bit to talk about how we get free and to ask about it in a specific way, which is that one of the goals of this series is to create a space to talk about race as it relates to the academy. And I sometimes daydream about what the academy would look like if it were governed not by like white patriarchy, but by a feminist or queer or trans set of ethics. And so I was wondering
Probably
if you
wouldn't exist.
Well, probably. I know, but like there would be something.
But we're imagining. Yes.
Right? We're imagining. So I was hoping you would like daydream with me what an academic space would look like if it were governed by the principles of the Combahee River Collective Statement.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think I did a thing at a college that shall go unnamed. Was it last week or a few weeks ago? And I think, I was asked this question about what the college or university could do to further this social goal of what is the troika, the diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I guess the first thing would be to say that it is very difficult to imagine, because universities in particular now are, I think, and always have been viewed as this kind of rarefied space where, we can talk about ideas and imagine and all of this, but in a way that obscures its actual role and relationship to the communities that it inhabits. And it creates a delusion that colleges and universities are special. And in fact, they're not special. They're special in being able to hide the relationships of exploitation and oppression that really is what makes colleges function. So I think that if we were going to talk about, and what I mean by that is, it's easy to get caught up in the space in which to ponder ideas and to think differently about the world, which of course we all value as academics and intellectuals who are able to use these resources and spaces to do that. But we should never forget that there are, poor and working class, primarily Black and Brown people who work in such ways as to make that space possible, and who make that space legible through their own invisibility. And so I think that if we were to apply the principles that are really at the heart of the Combahee River Collective Statement, which is one of collectivity, which is one where we actually, the invisible is made visible, where we are able to essentially turn what is underneath upside down to bring it to the surface, that it would make the contemporary university unintelligible. And so that would be, that would be a positive thing. I mean, I think the thing about the Combahee River collective statement what is so powerful about it is its ability to hold both a contemporary truth, which is the kind of looking at the particular ways that Black women experience oppression and exploitation in our contemporary society, but it's able to hold that with another truth, which is about the ability of those same marginalized people to be at the center of political struggles that can ultimately transform not just their own circumstance, but can transform the world around them. And I think that is part of what we should be thinking about when we think not just about the universities and colleges, but when we think about our society in general, is that these are places that if they're truly to be equitable, because that's the other thing about universities and colleges, is that they have become increasingly exclusive over time, raising tuition for the pure sake of becoming rich, right? That there's no need for some of these private schools to be charging $70,000 or $80,000 a year to walk through their halls. I mean, it's a ghastly amount of money that is circulating through these spaces that are idealized and are seen in egalitarian terms, precisely because of what is hidden and what is not seen. And so I think that the Combahee River collective statement is really about disruption and making the invisible visible. And I think that it would ultimately, calls for the radical transformation of all of the spaces that we inhabit, because it really calls for the upending of capitalism as we know it. And as we know that these women were socialists and they were radicals, and radical in the truest sense of the word, which is about getting at the root of what makes people's lives hard in this society. And so, you know, I think that it would look radically different if the core kind of ideas of that statement were put into effect.
Agreed. And I don't know, maybe I believe small acts of daydreaming can potentially seep into spaces a little bit.
No, it's good. It is good to, I think that is also part of it's part of the lesson that we can't just confine what is possible, you know, or what we imagine could be different based on politically what is possible and pragmatic. Because then, you know, what are we left with if we can only sort of imagine changing things based on the existing tools, you know, that we get a Black president of our particular school, you know, that we get a Black woman as president of, you know, a particular college in university as like the ultimate expression of what can change. And, you know, but we've seen lots of examples of how that in and of itself, representation in and of itself, doesn't actually transform the conditions that have given rise for the need for representation in the first place. I think in the aftermath of the first Black president and after the ongoing situation where we have more Black elected political leaders than at any time in American history, and yet, you know, we're all watching the horror show of this trial in Minneapolis of, you know, this Black man being lynched in public. And so the existence of the concentration of power, the representation of power does not in and of itself transform the conditions on the ground. And that means that we have to look beyond the existing tools that exist, that we have to look beyond what is possible and pragmatic. And that, that is the power of imagining things differently.
No one would ever come to activist work if it didn't involve some kind of imaginative work.
Exactly.
Your bio at Princeton describes you as a scholar activist, and there's obviously a clear activist social justice thread in the topics of your books. And I know you've also done work with organizations like the International Socialist Organization. What does it mean to you to be a scholar and an activist at the same time? And also, what can folks today learn from scholars and activists of the past who have tried to balance those two trajectories at the same time?
I mean, for me, I literally left the organizing to pursue a graduate degree so that I could figure out this thing about segregation in Chicago that I really wanted to understand. But for me, there was never any question that I was trying to understand this for the sake of helping, not just my own activism, but also the groups who were organizing and doing at that time, this is 2008, 2009, work to keep people from losing, working class families from losing their homes to foreclosure or who were facing threat of eviction. And so for me, there was never any question of whether these things could be combined. And so even, when I wrote the BLM book, which, was not an academic book by any stretch of the imagination, it was a book written in both in solidarity with the movement, but also as someone who is very close to anti-police and anti-police brutality organizing. And so it was written in that spirit. And so, for me, this is much more a case of trying to figure out what was actually scholarly in my work and for my work. And, I think that I was able to, I have been able to figure out that for me, it's like questions of scholarship are not questions that exist outside of these urgent political questions about how do we change the world. So, those are questions about the state. Those are questions about power. Those are questions about race and gender and social hierarchies. I mean, those are questions that are both questions that are under constant scrutiny and investigation and scholarship, but questions that hold tremendous meaning for social movements to actually try to understand. And then I think, politically, that there's an entire tradition of Black scholarship that has always held these two things together. I mean, the discipline of Black studies itself comes out of not just social movements, but Black insurgency. And so the kind of revolution, the Black revolution on campus, as Martha Biondi's book calls it, is really about the demand to tear down this artificial wall between what is considered to be scholarly and what is critical for Black communities, like politically and intellectually. to grapple with as part of an ongoing freedom struggle. And so, for me, these things have not been contradictory. I will say that I do think that it's also important that we not be moralistic about this. I mean, I think the university, like, people should be, it should be a space where people study whatever they want to study, And so if that means that you're interested in, rock formation, like whatever, that's a legitimate field of inquiry, that there shouldn't be, conversely, some kind of moral obligation to, study what is quote unquote socially useful. Part of the point of academic freedom should be academic freedom. That there should be these are spaces that should be preserved for the pursuit of knowledge and for the engagement of any number of ideas that provoke interest, whether it's among 10 people or whether, it's among the quote unquote masses.
Mm-hmm. So I'll open it up for questions after just asking this one last question. So if people have things they want to ask or comment on, go ahead and pop it into the chat. But I will selfishly conclude with one other question on my mind, which is I teach a lot of the qualitative and interpretive methods courses for grad students here at Annenberg, so that there's an avid interest among many of our students in how to bring social justice commitments into their methodology. So sometimes this shows up as multimodal work, or other times it can look like Black feminist autoethnography. So as as an activist who does historical and archival research, can you talk about how activism has shaped your methods?
Sure. I think you have to, one, have a healthy suspicion of the archive, And so if anything, this probably Saidiya Hartman has done more to not just shape that, but to, because I think existing in the world helps to shape that. Like, any authoritative, quote unquote, authoritative body of knowledge should be held with, some question. But to pursue that, to pursue that suspicion outside of the archive. And so, as someone who has organized on a very kind of intimate level, meaning going to meetings 9 days a week and, just in the work, that the work that people do is not in an archive. That if you're like organizing to keep NATO out of Chicago, if you're, organizing against, the death penalty in Illinois, that at most of the meetings that you're involved in, there is no archive being kept. And so when you come back and, as someone, who, especially on the question of the death penalty in Illinois, a topic of which people write books about now, you're sort of keenly aware of what is not, included in some of these emergent histories. And so it means that you really have to, for me, it has meant, in understanding that, is that you have to look widely. And that sometimes you have to find the people, sometimes it can lead you into all sorts of different kinds of places. And I think that if you just have a doctrinaire view of this, or if you are, because I had, my first year methods class I took in the history department at Northwestern. It was very like, you have to write this 50-page paper based on archival research. And the thing that I was, the thing that I was writing about, there was a lot archivally about it, except for the people who were most impacted by some of these policies. I was writing about contract buyers in Chicago, people who had to buy their homes on installment plans because they couldn't get conventional mortgages. And so for me, especially in this book that I just wrote, that I knew already that would be a prime issue. And so then the question is, where do you go to find the experiences of these women? How do you capture that? And that, led me in a totally different set of places and different kinds of materials. And so that was a very kind of concrete experience for me. Is that you just have to think broadly, and you have to know and have a very kind of visceral understanding of what gets left out of these formal collections, the formal archives of the federal government, and even what is in there. You have to have a healthy skepticism about, and so that's probably my kind of main experience around this.
Apparently, you also have to have a serendipitous encounter with an attorney. But can I tell you, that stuff terrifies me, because you're not, we all have people in our lives who my friend Kevin is he ran into someone at a garage sale who was selling these he studies bulletin board systems of the early internet, who was selling these bulletin board system manuals. And then he was like, oh, can I use this for my dissertation data? And it's well, what if you walk down the other street that day? So yeah. Serendipitous is so true. And it's actually a powerful concept in library science of serendipity.
Oh, interesting.
But it's times what?
It's, but you also put yourself in positions for that, right? Mm-hmm. As somebody who does research, some serendipity is created, right? And so
very true. And that's the whole principle of, there's a library science organization, Shiali Ramarita Ranganathan. He has a whole faceted classification system that's meant to produce serendipity in the stacks.
Wow.
And his whole, so that's the kind of structured serendipity that you're talking about,
Yeah, serendipity in the stacks is I don't know the person that you're referring to, but as a phenomenon is, this is part of this, when this is part of the horror of this pandemic is is the library, and just walking around and, seeing something that you didn't go there for, and walking out with a weird 12 books that you didn't intend to get. But yeah,
no, this is very true of the library, but also the broader idea of the city being your library, because the kinds of, random conversations, teaching this workshop right now for students writing their proposals, there have been multiple times where students have said, I know I would have better answers to this if I'd had the opportunity to have hallway conversations with people where you refine those ideas. So.
Totally.
So I hear you. We do have a question from Michael Deli Carpini, who wants to know if your university and or your discipline, history in particular, honor and reward the kind of activist scholarship that you do.
I think it, like everything, it depends on where you're at, I'm in an African American Studies department that I think, because of the particular history of African American studies, is much more kind of open to public scholarship, is less skeptical about the value of public scholarship, and as a result is more kind of sympathetic. I think that probably some of the attitudes in the more quote unquote traditional disciplines are probably changing. not necessarily, I'm sure there's like a layer of faculty who've been around forever and, who hew to a kind of narrow-minded conservative view of what scholarship is, that sees it as remote, and we should continue to write journal articles for 6 people, and that is the true measurement of impact. But I think that for most thinking people and most people engaged in the real world, realize that you can both value that, and you can also value scholarship that is reaching a broader audience and is involved in broad public conversations that are consequential. And, I think that's the direction that everyone needs to be headed in, that we don't need to see intellectualism, the distribution and engagement of ideas is something for a narrow band of people to think about and engage in, but that this is part of shaping the kind of public that is necessary to be civically engaged, civically in charge, and really at the forefront of being involved in social movements that are transforming the direction of different kinds of societies. This one, and as well as others beyond here.
I'm haunted by something a friend told me once about activism in the academy, which is that the academy is a space that neoliberals have set aside for more radical thinkers so that we won't have more of an impact on the general society. And this haunts me.
I think that, and even that, I think that there's some degree of truth to that, but even, it's all very qualified, right? It's like, certain kinds of radicalism, certain kinds of thought, but not all. Nobody wants to talk about Palestine, right? Mm-hmm. No one wants to talk about the nature of colleges and universities. So they don't want you to be, you could talk about some radical ideas, but we don't want our graduate faculty, which is what many of them are, unionized. We don't want it to go too far. Let's just talk about things, So there's, to some extent that that is true, but I think to a larger extent, the university is becoming increasingly more reflective of the kind of corporate sector where it's tremendous growth on top. Do we need another provost? Do we even know what a provost is, right? And now they're multiplying. The 6-figure positions are multiplying. And so I think as that process continues, that even the idea that colleges and universities are tolerant of, radical ideas in the humanities shrinks. And we see even greater, the right loves to go on and on about cancel culture on campuses, like the left is governing campuses. But if you're actually on a campus, you know that it's the exact opposite, that it's the left that is policed. It's left-wing ideas that are policed because administrations are afraid of the right, and so the right is given wide berth to do, pretty much what they want to do. And so, I think that as it becomes much more reflective of these, domineering institutions in society writ large, that whatever space exists for radicals becomes shrunken.
Well, to your point, I'm thinking about the right loves to go on about, like gender studies programs. And at Penn, our GSWS program is hanging on by a thread. And it actually has this very powerful activist history. It was started by a sit-in, led by someone at the School of Dentistry. It was badass woman from the School of Dentistry was like leading this sit-in after a very high-profile violent campus, and that's how we got this center. And then now you look, I mean, it's just been defunded and defunded and defunded, and now it's just hanging on by a thread. And it's like, I wish we were as powerful as Tucker Carlson seems to think we are, but that's just not
crazy.
The case.
They literally think we're running the school, and it's like, no, we're in little underfunded departments. Sorry.
We do have a question from my old friend Beza Marid, who is asking, when you are writing for public audiences, how do you decide where to place a particular piece? Is it for an imagined audience or desired impact? I think that's a great question.
I think, I mean, for me, prior to this past year, I think that all of my writing was pretty much in conversation of one variety or another within the left, you know, and so that's primarily where I was publishing. And then this time last year, the New York Times started to solicit me to write articles, which I did. And then, you know, by the end of the summer, I had agreed to write for the New Yorker exclusively. So I'm a contributing writer for the New Yorker, and I have I basically just write for them as a kind of dedicated space where if I want to write about something, I don't have to do pitches and shop things. So, I mean, it's weird because the dedicated audience there are primarily liberals, but because of the way the internet works, it obviously goes, you know, beyond that. So I don't know, you know, I write the same way, but the audience that I write for is significantly broader than it used to be. Muted.
I know. I was typing an answer to Sarah Jackson, who wrote a very affirming comment and then also asked a question, but we aren't going to have time for that because I want to respect our speaker's time and everyone else's time. That maybe all probably have other Zooms to scoot off to. But in our mediated Zoom way, please join me in thanking Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor for comments. I just really enjoyed getting to speak with you today, and I'm so glad everyone is able to attend. Also, major shout out to our IT folks, Andres and Rich, and to Deb Williams for coordinating this talk. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, take care, y'all.
All right, take care.